Adele Ruxton. Okay.
Snap.
I hope I didn't take your nose. Good to finally sit down with you, Adele. First of all, we're neighbors. We live a couple, maybe a mile or so.
Yes, I think so. You're just to the east of me.
Yeah, your neighborhood's very nice, a little nicer than my neighborhood. That's all right. How long have you lived in this house?
Since 1964, so we're in the 60th year.
Mm-hmm. And when you moved in here, did someone else own it, or?
Nope.
You were the first people?
Yes.
Really?
I've been here all this time.
And so was it built and did you meet the builder, or?
It was built by John Outcall.
Mm-hmm.
And the construction person was Bennett.
Okay. So did you connect with this house when he was finished or while he was?
I had no idea that I was ever going to live in this house when my husband built the house. This was not part of the itinerary that went along with the house. That came a few months later, just as the house was being finished.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in 64.
So where were you living before this house?
Before I lived for the year before, when I came out to the desert, which was in 63, early 63, I lived in a duplex in Thermal, which was owned by the postmaster of that area.
Who was that?
And then taught school at Oasis School.
Oh. So
and I was only coming to teach from March until the end of June. And then I really liked the school. I liked the people at the school. We just kind of caught on, and I told the principal superintendent, I'll stay another year.
Oh. So you were living in Down Valley, and you were teaching Down Valley as well.
Mm-hmm. I had been in Torrance.
Mm-hmm.
I had been back to Torrance. I had taught in Northern California, in the city of Santa Clara for a couple of years. And then I had a roommate whose parents were with the U.S. government and were working overseas. And the second year that Jan and I were together as roommates, and we had two other roommates with us, her father said, we're going to Bangkok. Why don't you come over here? Jan and I had been taking Spanish industriously for that whole year because we were going to spend the year in Mexico. Well, that didn't turn out to be that. That on Mother's Day, I called my mom and said, you better put Dad on the phone too. This is now in 1960. And she said, what's going on? And when Dad got on, I said, Jan, whom they had met, we're going to teach school, at least for the next year in Bangkok, Thailand.
In 1960?
Big pause. Big pause.
I think.
And Janet's parents were pretty pleased. And it was going to be something new for me. I had flown up and down the coast a lot of times. In fact, at that point, I even had, in fact, Jan and I both had tickets to the summer performances in San Francisco clear through the summer. And when we did it during the 2 years that we were together, I would fly up if I were in Torrance again. I would fly up and stay overnight and then come back to Torrance again because then it was like summer break or Easter break or whatever it was.
Now, how would
and
you
then I went off to Bangkok.
How would you fly up there? Was it what airline did you use at the time?
Oh gosh, I was afraid you'd ask that because it was a very small airline, And they had this little bird that sat in the seat. And one day I'm going to look it up and find out exactly what the airline was called, because to fly out of Los Angeles, and I can't remember if it was round trip or one way, but it cost $19.95.
That's funny.
And so it was cheaper than the tickets that we had to the plays that I went back to see during summer break.
So you would fly up just for the night, just to go to do something and come back.
Uh-huh.
Now, that was Torrance Airport, or what was that?
I flew out of Los Angeles.
Oh, you did.
And it wasn't called LAX. It was called the Los Angeles Airport.
Yeah.
There was no Bradley's name because he hadn't even been the mayor yet. And there were no letters to identify an airport at that time. So you flew out of the Los Angeles. And I guess it was probably called the International Airport.
Yeah.
Same place, just a lot larger now.
You mentioned your friend Jan. Is she still alive?
Janet died about 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
She had brain cancer, which was something that no one ever, you don't suspect that that's what's going to happen to you. But she lived to be in her early 80s. And I went to see her, about a few months, I guess, before she passed away. And by this time, she was living and had been living for a long time in and around Phoenix, Arizona, because when her father retired at the end of his career, he retired to Sun City, Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually Janet had married. She lived on the East Coast, had 3 children. I was at the wedding. The marriage did not work out. The 3 children did work out. One of the children has died since. That was from an automobile and a motorcycle accident. And Janet was a teacher. She worked for American Express. Oh my goodness, she just did a world of things. And,
was she was a big influence on you? You were a big influence?
Well, we just kept in touch with
I
her.
see.
It was like one of those good friends where if you even hadn't seen each other or written to them or been on the phone, and then all of a sudden you got together, you could take up from where you left off.
I know what you mean. That's a special thing. So the 2 of you did end up going to Bangkok.
We went to Bangkok, and we had such a good time. One of her brothers was in junior in high school at the international school, which is where we were. And at that time, it was a brand new school. They had another school for, no, it wasn't just Americans. It was really an international school. The Thai children, however, unless your mother or father were married to a Thai, they had their own schools. So we had like 56, or I think it was finally said there are 56 different nationalities on this campus. But we taught everything in English because most of those children, not necessarily military, because I should say this too, that when Jan and I left California, our friends said, "See you after the war." Nobody ever would have thought that the Vietnam War would have gone on or even had started the way that it did. So we were there at the beginning of this, and the only children that were now sent to school in Thailand and Cambodia, they were the offspring of somebody that was high up in the military. It had to be a colonel or somebody in that, or worked for the embassy, or would have been medical personnel, something like that. But there were no bases at that time in Thailand. There were the Thai military bases, but there weren't any Americans particularly. And like Janet's father, he worked with people that, again, had come over with the U.S. government. It was called United States Overseas Mission at that time. And so they had families, and they lived in Bangkok. So again, we had the personnel who sent their children to school were pretty upscale at the time.
Well, where did you live?
We lived with Janet's parents in a 2-story house and this was very, I should say, this is something that most people did have. There were probably very few Thai that were landlords or even proprietors or even owned the large houses. They were mostly owned by Chinese. So we had a Chinese landlord, and people lived in compounds. So we had actually lived in a compound with only the 2 houses, the Chinese landlord and the 2-story house that we lived in. Only air conditioning in 1 room, but we did have 1 bedroom that was air conditioned. The rest of everything, you never got used to jungle heat, let me tell you. But you do get used to living with the hot, humid, drippy jungle heat that maybe in January gets down to you might need a sweater, but on the other hand, you could probably do without.
Why were you interested in going there? What was your interest in going there in the first place?
To Thailand particularly, because Janet's parents were living there.
Were you a little nervous about it?
They were interested in having Janet come over and visit. I should say too that some years before, Janet was a graduate of Kansas State, and her mother and father had lived. In fact, they'd all lived in Kansas. And they'd all gone to school in Kansas. And some years before, when her father was working at he finally worked at the college, they were doing some things in the Far East, like planting crops, because he was a farmer. I mean, he not necessarily, because he was in the college business, but he taught farming and engineering and ranching and all those kind of things. So these were people that were needed. And his first assignment was in Manila in the Philippines. And Jan had gone there during a school break at one time before I knew her. And so it was like, well, we don't know how long we're going to be here, meeting her parents. So we want you to come over. And the reason I got there was because Janet said in a letter to her parents, well, you have to take Adele with you. You have to take Adele too. She's coming with me. And so everything was fine. I had met them once because they were on home leave. When Jan and I were living in Mountain View, we had also lived in an apartment in Sunnyvale. But anyway, they were coming through on home leave, so I had met them the one time. So they figured, well, they had a house that was big enough, and the one son was going to be there. The second son was of the younger set. They had another son that was much older than the other 3 children. And he was already a veterinarian and was living in the Chicago area and was married. Didn't have any children at that time, but he had married. And so we knew that when we got to Bangkok, we were going to have a place to be. We had seen some pictures. And we had our own room, and everybody had their own room. It was big enough. And
Now, had you been familiar with, for example, were you familiar with like Thai food or something like that? Are you?
before?
Yeah.
No, none of us were.
Oh.
No, this was a brand new experience. And like Janet said, if you lived in Kansas, you didn't even know. In fact, it wasn't until after Ed and I were married that we went to Cleveland to see an old friend of his. And this was probably in the late 60s or into the 70s. And in Cleveland, Ohio, tacos were just coming into being. And I remember his friend saying, "Oh, we have this new restaurant we want to take you to." And so Ed and I go, "Well, okay, that's fine." They lived in the suburbs of Cleveland. And we went to the Taco restaurant.
Oh, how funny.
We kept saying, "No, it's called taco. It's not called taco."
Well, that was pretty out there. I didn't realize how you were so adventuresome. Right away, you were adventuresome.
Well, it was kind of funny. I never had been as a youngster. And my father had relatives who lived in Germany. And he seemed to have done, and we would hear stories about Dad's travels to see his grandmother in Germany when he was 8 and when he was 10 years old. And my mother ventured, when she graduated from high school, she did go to Oregon and Washington. But then they became armchair travelers.
Yeah.
And later years kind of did their armchair travelers in hindsight with the help of their 2 girls who liked to travel. And said,
well, when you told your mom that you were going to Thailand, what was her? Was she just okay with it right away, or she said you need?
Oh, she didn't mind as long as I was going with Jan, and we knew then we were going to live with her parents, and her brother was going to be there, and a second brother was. Amazing. And the reason the second brother came while we were there was that he was on his way to Marburg, Germany, to go his last 2 years at the university in Marburg. And so he stopped in Bangkok until school began. He'd also been at Kansas State, and he stopped in Bangkok then to spend the rest of the summer with the family. And then we told Kenyon goodbye. And off he went to go to school in the fall of 1960. Well, was it? Yeah, I guess it was. Yeah, 1960.
When you went to Thailand, were you already finished your studies, or were you still studying? Or?
No, I was finished.
Oh, you were finished.
I had my teaching credential, and I had received that at UC Santa Barbara, and that had happened in 1958. I graduated from high school in 1954. That was in Torrance. Same high school that my mother graduated. Same high school that my uncles had graduated from. My father had graduated from high school and also here in college in South Dakota, because that part of the family from Chicago, they were heading west. But his father got as far as South Dakota and started to stick around for a while, and married a gal that he met who was also on her way west. So I had a grandmother and a grandfather who lived in the little town of Wessington. And then eventually everybody ended up in California.
Yeah.
And then Mr. Torrance, he started calling for people to come out to California because he was founding this town. Was his dream, that he wanted this. It wasn't going to be named after him. That was the last thing he wanted.
Oh, is that right?
But when the Dominguez Land Company was formed, and that's who my father went to work for, they got together. This is all in at the beginning when my mom came to Torrance, it was in 1912. When my father came, it was in 1920, when he had finished his accountancy, whatever you want to call it. I don't know what they called it then, but he had a degree in accountancy, and he was working at the bank in Wessington following the First World War. My father had also been in the First World War. Neither one of them went any place except being very local.
How did it turn out that they named that town Torrance? How did that?
Well, the Dominguez land is because we had all the minutes. My father was finally the secretary of the Dominguez Land Company, which is what the whole corporation, it was a company before it was a corporation. And because when my dad, it finally came apart because it unraveled as things happened and the town grew and all the lots were sold, that the paperwork all went to my father's house. And when I started reading through it, even with him, that's when I discovered, and he'd kind of forgotten about it too, that Mr. Torrance would come to the Dominguez Land Company meetings, and they would discuss, they had all kinds of names for the town. And the one thing he kept saying was that, but I don't want it named after me. Well, when the group got together and he wasn't there, they took a vote and they named it Torrance, and he accepted that.
So you graduated Torrance High, right?
Yes.
And then you went to Kansas State, or you went back to Kansas?
No. I didn't meet Janet until after I graduated from college. So I was in California and went to El Camino Community College right after high school. I wanted to go to Santa Barbara, but my mom, who was she was always on somebody's bandwagon, let's face it. And she said, you and your sister, I was a sister 2 years younger than myself. And she said, both of you girls are going to go to El Camino. I put out too many pieces of paper to have people sign to get that college there. Right. So she said, you're at least going to start there.
Okay.
Well, then the second year came, and there was no housing at Santa Barbara. It was all the first housing. Well, Santa Barbara started in Santa Barbara on the Mesa campus. Well, then it moved out to Goleta near the airport. And that was where there was a military base during the Second World War. Now, I did go to summer school there, and I lived in a barracks building, and that's how the school started. They've since torn everything down. But during summer and at the first of each school year, they lived in barracks for a while, and I had some friends that did live there, but I wanted to live in the new dormitory, Santa Rosa Hall. So I waited until I was a junior, went up to Santa Barbara, lived in, then I still couldn't get into the dormitory. I still couldn't live on campus. I wanted the experience of living on a school campus, and I still wanted to go to school in Santa Barbara. We had girls next door to us in Torrance, that one had graduated from there and the other had graduated from UCLA. And it just sounded to me like the program, and I wanted to work with early childhood in that kind of a program. And that was the only place that I could get it. And so I went then in my junior year, starting with summer school. I did live on campus in a barracks building. And then for the fall, I lived in a home in Santa Barbara, where a gal with 2 children took in, there were 6 girls. We were all waiting for campus housing. So she took in the 6 of us, where we stayed for the whole year. She was Janet Clark by that time. Her family was in the building and design and construction business. And so we were practically, we were across the street from the downtown park. It was a beautiful location, a couple of blocks off of the main road through Santa Barbara. And I loved it. And we had a great time. 2 girls to each big bedroom, and she and her family lived in below. She didn't have a husband at that time anymore. But then when it came to the end, Santa Rosa Hall, we knew was finished. And I said, I am moving. And some of the rest of us moved out to Santa Rosa Hall. And unless you were moving into a sorority, which I did not join. I was in a sorority when I was at El Camino College, but I chose not to do that and get to the business of getting a credential when I got to college.
So you did get a credential, and the credential was from Santa Barbara?
Yes.
And it was early childhood?
Early childhood.
Did you
which after a few years, the state didn't even issue it anymore. And I had the choice of getting the preschool through the 8th grade. We were given that choice, and I chose to keep what I had. And I always said, I don't want those great big kids stepping on my feet. I'll take the little ones. And I enjoyed it and mostly I taught not only the first Head Start that started here in the Valley, but also did mostly kindergarten and 1st grade. I did 2nd and 3rd grade.
Was that in Palm Desert, or where was that located?
That was when I was in, the first teaching was up in south of San Francisco.
Oh, okay.
And then came out here.
Okay.
As I say, after I started home again, and after 2 years, I was thinking about taking another international job. But then I hadn't seen my parents by this time, my sister had come to Bangkok on kind of a slow boat to China. And she had made some stops, and so she met me in Bangkok. And by the middle, I taught summer school the last year I was there. And as I say, Jan and I decided we would stick it out for 2 years because we had just had such a good time, and we could travel. There were so many holidays that you had to do something. So we were not only taking the American holidays, but we were taking the Thai holidays also.
Well, how would you write? Would you write and receive letters from your family or friends?
Telephones were out of the question.
Right.
So yes, so we wrote letters, and Janet's dad was pretty funny. That he sat everybody down at I guess it was on Sunday, and he said, I'll be going to the post office, which would be at the American post office, because we shopped a lot at the PX and so on, because he had the privileges there. So he sat everybody down on Sunday and said, you can't leave the house until you've written your letter home, because I am delivering all these letters tomorrow. And in those days too, if you did have to make a telephone call, you made a reservation at the local post office. And it might be that day, it could be the next week, or maybe never at all. And when you were traveling, which I did when I left Bangkok, when my sister came, that we had to keep stopping at American Express offices and write a letter to my mom and dad ahead of time so that she or he could write a letter to the next American Express office where we picked up the mail with all the rest of the American tourists.
You weren't. I bet you, as a person who who taught at the American school, you were not really a tourist. You don't consider yourself a tourist.
No, not anymore. No, after a few months, you were now, because by this time your visa had expired, and you were now with a passport that you better keep with you. But then I have to say, and people don't understand this, and you might, Leslie, that people who were alive in those days, when you traveled, yes, on your person you kept your passport, but it was in a drawer at home and wherever you were living. And if you checked into a hotel, the hotel took your passport.
That's right. They kept it
and put it in a little box so you could see it with your room key, and then you could pick it up when you wanted to. But it was security for them, so that I gather that they knew they were going to be paid for their room and board. If you were going to stay there, then they'll keep your passport until you pay the bill. But they were pretty lenient about checking it in and out. There were problems even then that have gone on for years and years. I said to my husband one time, and this is even years ago, he always said, I want to go where you've been. And he did some traveling before I ever met him. And he said, I want to see where you lived, and I want to see things that you and your sister did. And I said to him one time, are you sure you want to go to Lebanon? You want to go to Beirut? Well, I'll have to think about that. And I said, do you want to go to Syria? And this is in more recent times, of course, and it's just gotten worse. And I would say to him, if he were alive, do you think you want to go to Jerusalem with me right now? Probably not. But it was interesting to see these places.
Absolutely.
And it was not always before the war. It would be after the war, or you knew something was going to happen, or the plane had been canceled. And then you had to figure out, how am I going to get, and this was a good example, how am I going to get from Beirut to Damascus? Because that is the typical route for people that are traveling in the Middle East. Wasn't so bad in the Far East, but then there were even, I'm jumping around, but there were problems too. When Jan and I went, Eisenhower was the president at that particular time. And when we got to Tokyo, which we spent some time in Hawaii, did not go to the Philippines. And then we're going to spend a whole day in Tokyo before we went on to Hong Kong and then to Bangkok. And her parents understood that we wanted to see some things, but maybe you're never going to get back again. Of course, that were famous last words. But when we got to Tokyo, we spent the entire day at the airport because there were some un-American activities going on in Tokyo. Eisenhower's trip was canceled. All Americans that had come in to on any airline that day were just stuck at the airport until they could be going on to Hong Kong, but we couldn't go into Tokyo. So that was trips that I took later. But again, when my sister and I were trying to get to Damascus, I said, Kathy, remember I told you that I met a gal in Bangkok who'd been over to the house, and she was a travel agent in Lebanon. She was in Lebanon, and she was in Beirut. And she said, you know, if you and your sister, she knew that I was going to be taking this trip. I don't even remember why she was at the house. But anyway, she was. And this turned out to be a very, very wonderful thing, because I said, Kathy, remember, I met so-and-so. And she said, if you get into trouble, come to me. And we did. And she found a high school friend of hers with his own car because she says they're going to take your passport and you're
Oh,
not
I
going to
know,
get it
you're
back.
right.
People had come into her office and already had their passports taken and couldn't get them back. So she says, you still have your passport? And I said, yes. And so she said, if you trust me, she says, I have this friend who has a car, and it'll take all day, but I will get you to Damascus along with my friend from school. And that's what we did. And she says, and then when we got in the car, we couldn't say anything. I don't know how many stops we made. Sometimes in the back seat would be somebody with medals. Sometimes it would be somebody that had to put chickens on top of his car in crates. And then the next time it would be, and it was like border crossing, until finally we got to Damascus.
How long did that take?
We got to the hotel, and strangely enough, we told the driver goodbye, thanked him so much, and off he went. It wasn't until the next day that Kathy and I are settled, and I said, where's your camera? She said, oh my gosh, I left it in his car. And she said, well, where's yours? And I said, on the back seat floor of the car that got us here. So we went out and we purchased a cheap box camera. And eventually my mom gets a letter from one of her, we told her what was going on. And we finally get a letter, and she gets our cameras before we ever got home. That fellow took it back, our cameras back to Beirut, where they had our names and addresses, and sent them to my folks' address in Torrance. So we never lost any pictures.
Oh, that's a sweet,
It was
really
amazing.
great story.
But there were times when I would say to Kathy, we should be a little bit leery and maybe a little bit scared. But when you're in your early 20s, everything is not that serious.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't then.
Yeah.
And yet there were serious things happening.
Right.
We couldn't go to the American University in Beirut. That had closed up. And I had danced the night away at the Erewhon Hotel. Well, that never happened because Beirut was going to be under siege. And so it was like, just chalk it up to another experience. And we probably knew less about what was happening than people who lived in the United States, because we never saw any papers that were probably in English. Once in a while you pick up the Stars and Stripes, but it was always behind.
Yeah.
And when I get these letters, mostly from my mom, she was more concerned.
Yeah.
And we would just write back and say, Mom, don't worry about it. We're fine.
Yeah.
We're on to the next stop. We're following our schedule.
How interesting. I had no idea you were adventuresome like that. Good for you. Well, when did you meet your husband?
I met my husband when I first came here. When I got home.
To the desert?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I met him in the desert. When my sister and I, she didn't get home until Thanksgiving. But Jan had met somebody in Bangkok, and they were engaged to be married. Well, I probably would have stuck with my sister. However, I got home at the Los Angeles airport on Halloween, and believe it or not, which would never happen anymore, every employee at the airport was dressed in disguise. Everybody looked like Halloween. You didn't know the baggage checker, everybody who worked there had a Halloween costume. So Mom and Dad both came after me, and they said, Kathy's not coming home. And I said, well, Janet's getting married on the day after Thanksgiving. But I had already received some letters from my mother saying that if you want me to make your dress for Janet's wedding, you're going to have to get home, because I haven't seen you in 2.5 years. And besides that, you have sent material, but I don't know what your size is. I don't even know really much about what you look like in person. So if you still want me to make a dress, then you're going to have to get here. So that was the main reason why I got home, so that I could go to Illinois for Janet's wedding at the toward the end of the month. And she was going to be married in a town where it was out of Chicago, it was a suburb of Chicago, and it was where her oldest brother lived.
Is this connected to your husband?
It was connected to Janet.
Well, we're talking about how you met your husband in the desert.
Then how I met my husband. Well, then it was later that when I got home, I kind of skipped this bit about Edward. When I got home, and I kind of just fooled around for a while, and all my friends were either having babies or getting married, and I was just sort of like, I don't know what to do. And my mom said, oh, stick around, and I did have a good time with her. And I had a good time with the folks. My sister by this time had taken a job in Northern California up around Santa Rosa, so she wasn't there. So I finally said to Mom after the first of the year, I said, I'm going to get hold of my counselor at Santa Barbara and see if he can find me a job where it's warmer, because was so cold at the coast when I've been in all this heat. So anyway, I called, and he says there's a job at Oasis School in the desert. Well, I looked around Torrance, and Mom says, why don't you just stay up here? And I said, no, everybody went to school here. I said, I'm going out to the desert, because you open all the windows all the time, and it's like, I don't need all that fresh air. I'm going to the desert. Mm-hmm. So I went to Oasis School.
And now that was 19 what?
In 1960, let's see, 1960.
You say 1960s.
Now. No, I'm in 1960.
How many students would be at a school like that in the 1960s?
Well, they didn't have certain schools, so everybody was at either at and it wasn't in a unified school district. So there were probably 500, 600 students at Oasis School, even though it was out in the ranch area. Mm-hmm. And that's when I said I really liked the school. And I decided that I think I'll stay. And at that time, if you wanted to make a change from any school in this valley, you had to quit that job and then
reapply.
Mm-hmm. There was no going someplace else and trying it out. No, that didn't work. You had to actually resign. And I decided I would stay. Well, in the fall of that same year, after I had been there from March until June, I went home because I had to take a class, and I went to Long Beach State to take the class in tests and measurements. And so,
let's come back to the desert, though.
That's where I am.
Oh, okay.
I'm in the desert now. I'm living in Thermal.
Oh, okay.
And I have to come back to take a class. And the next year, after I had been here for the 5 or 6 months, I knew that there was going to be a new principal coming into the school. And he was going to take over for the building of another school down at the Salton Sea. And it was going to be named Seaview School. And everybody said, oh, we all know Mr. Ruxton. everybody's called Mr. and Mrs. in those days. Nobody called anybody by their first name. And so Mr. Ruxton came in September because he had resigned. He had been the superintendent principal at Mecca School for about 5 years. And then he decided he would go back to school and work on another document, even though he had his administrative credentials and had been teaching and being a superintendent of a small school up near Mammoth, up on the high desert and in that area in Northern California. And so Mr. Robert Lumen called him back and said, Ed, forget your studies up there. I need you here. And he says, I want you to open the school down at the Salton Sea. So that's when I met Ed, which was in September of the year I decided to come back. And within a few months, the school was, I guess we were into a couple of years. But anyway, the school was open. And Robert Lumen said, Ed, when they decided they had the money to build it and so on and so forth, that, do you have any recommendations on who might build the school? And Ed said, yes, use John Outcall. He's building my house. And he built the high desert campus for the community colleges around here. He's built the first library in Palm Desert and all these homes. And she says, I don't know whether he's ever built a primary school or not, but give him a chance. So John Outcall actually built that school. And Ed opened the school, which would have been probably in 67, maybe 66 or 67, to not only the representative from the county and the supervisor, but millions and millions, I should say thousands of crickets. It was a year that the cricket invasion was here. And if you ever saw the pictures of the principal standing at the door and all these kids, he is standing there and you can't really tell him.
Do you have a picture
from
of
the
that?
Crickets. Oh, someplace.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, well, we had a lot of cricket invasions. We would have the yellow moths, the grasshoppers, the crickets, and the cockroaches. And I got through it all. I didn't like these things, but
So you were living out there, and then you were teaching out there, and then you met.
And I met Edward out there. He came back, and they had a lot of these schools when in the old days before the unification and so many other houses, they had housing at the schools.
Yeah.
And he lived in one of the mobile homes at the school. Oasis had 3, 4, 5 houses, and then they had some mobile homes, and Ed lived in one of the mobile homes. And even when he was at Mecca, he lived in a little house on somebody's ranch out there. But then he had done the same thing when he was in Northern California. He had lived in a house on somebody's ranch. It was a typical thing that people did. And then I knew that he was going to start building a house in December, but I didn't know much about him. And we kind of got thrown together in 64 because people were retiring and leaving, and it was like, okay, Adele, you and Ed go out and find the gifts, or you chaperone the dance that we're having. And that's how it all kind of started.
That's cute.
And I don't know, a lot of people know this story, that I did not even know when he had proposed to me. I just took it very lightly when we went to the Erewhon Hotel, which had opened about that time. And he took me to dinner there after we had gone shopping for somebody's gift or did. And he used to come into my class sometimes. And since he was unmusical, and I had to go play the piano for one of the programs, he would come in and stay with my children. And they thought it was always really fun because he always had candy canes or M&Ms or whatever it was for the children when they came, when he was the babysitter. Well, anyway, that was not a very good term that we shouldn't use anymore.
That's sweet, though.
But anyway, so we went to something, we went out to dinner, but he took me nice places to eat when we had been out. And nothing, it was just a really nice friendship. I never met any of his family. He never met any of mine. I don't think my folks weren't even out here during the times that he came. And it was just when school was out in May, end of May, and we were at the Erewhon Hotel. And at that time, they had a place next door to the hotel, which is now the Miramonte, and it doesn't look the same anymore. But it looked like Bangkok, but it didn't. I was always having to go there, and somebody saying, "Does this look like Thailand?" No, it looks like a Japanese pagoda. But anyway, that's not what there aren't any buildings like this in Thailand. But anyway, that was beside the point. So we're sitting at the table and having dinner, and they had paper on all the tables. That was very common for a few years, where everything went, even a very nice hotel like the La Quina Hotel that always had cloth napkins, and all of a sudden they went for paper napkins and leather utility holders and paper on the table. It was just kind of crazy. And we went into a formal dining room. Well, my friend Edward started drawing a picture of this house on the so-called tablecloth. And he went on, and at the end of the picture, and it had everything from, I don't know, and he told me about Mr. Outcalled, and he told me about Mr. Outcalled's wife and his little girl. He'd met them all. And at the end of the conversation, he said, "I want you to come and help me decorate my house." And I didn't even take up on it. And I said, "Of course." I said, of course, to anybody when it was going to be a challenge, of course I would do it. And so I was gone for the summer because I had to take this class at Long Beach. And I stayed with my mom and dad, and my mom kept saying, "Who are you getting all these letters from?" And I would read them, and they would talk about what he had done at the house and so on and so forth. Always on the outside, and always this make-do furniture inside that somebody was pawned off on Ed because he would take it. He didn't have anything else. And so when I came back, and he called and he says, "I'll pick you up and we'll go out to eat." So we go back to school, but just before school started, he's sitting in some restaurant, which I couldn't even tell you where it was. And he says, "So when do you want to plan the wedding date?" And I said, "I don't know." And I just picked up on it. I didn't even know whether he was kidding or not, because he had a really good sense of humor. And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, well, if you're going to do my house, he said, then we better get married before we move into the house. Oh. And he says, I've just moved in with kind of sticks of furniture here and there. So when do you want to get married? And I remember saying, please, not on Halloween. And he said, then when? And I said, I just said, let's do it right after Christmas. I was ready.
It came right off your tongue like that.
It just came out. And within a few weeks, I went to meet some of his friends. This is in September, because nobody of his friends thought he was ever going to marry anybody. He never came around with, and I knew he had girls from school that, because he talked about where he had taken so-and-so. But I guess nothing was ever terribly serious. Mm-hmm. And his one particular friend who had been in school with him since they were 6 years old in Los Angeles, he was born in Milwaukee, came to Los Angeles when he was 6 years old and started school in East Los Angeles. His father was a cobbler, actually. Later went to work for the city of Los Angeles, but he started out that way. And so I now have a house that's coming up. I have a quote-unquote fiance. And he says, do you want a ring? And he always asks me these funny, and I said, no, I said, I'm not a diamond person. Let's just wait until we get a wedding ring. But I said, you probably should meet my folks now that I've met your friends. And they were, their mouths just dropped. When I showed up at the Pomona Fair with some of his friends, and I remember this Jacqueline took me aside and she said, did Ed really ask you? And I said, Jackie, I'm not sure, but I think he did. I said, the wedding date is December the 28th. I said, we decided that, but we haven't even met my folks yet. So anyway, then when the next time we go and we meet my mother and dad, my mother says, dear, are you marrying him? She kind of took me aside, and they liked him right away. I mean, it was just one of those things that just kind of all fell into place. Mm-hmm. And she whispered to me, and she says, are you marrying him for the house and his car? Or are you really marrying him for Edward? And I said, Mom, I know what you're talking about, because you told me one time, my dad was 13 years older than my mother, and Ed is now more than 16 years older than I am. And I said to Mom, I said, isn't that what people said to you? Exactly. Because my mother went off in 32, just when the Depression was coming up, in a brand new Buick convertible, and I'm marrying somebody that's been driving Porsches for the last 10 years of his life. So that was a funny between my mom and myself. And I said, Mom, this turnaround is fair play, isn't it? No, I said, Ed and I'll be fine together. It'll be more than that. Well, it lasted for 47 years, so I guess something worked.
I think so, yeah. Now, so you worked together at this school, the occult?
We worked together at the school. There was no problem with that. Mm-hmm. And so for 12 years, mm-hmm. He with 11, but I worked for 12 years at Oasis School. And between the two of us, we were asked to do the first Head Start program in the Valley, because now the man who had been the principal and took over as just the superintendent, that he says, I want you to be, he says, I'm going to send an application to Sacramento to see if we can be part of this new Head Start program coming in. Well, I was chosen as one of 7 in the state. And so Ed then went with me to San Diego, and with a few teachers who were going to be teaching in this valley, anyway, we decided that I would do it during the summer. And it was 8 weeks. I had already taught part of summer school just for the fun of it. Mm-hmm. And then I did another 8, but part of that was going to San Diego with a few other teachers from this valley. Only I was the one that they went to listen. I went to help write the program. Mm-hmm. And that is how Head Start began, with a few teachers, 7 from the state, in California, who wrote the program. Now that was not true, because I knew somebody later at Mecca School when I eventually did go, and I did teach school in Mecca, that she was in another state, and she was one of the people who went to a university mm-hmm. and wrote the program. Mm-hmm. So it was different all over, but it was great fun.
What do you think when you go to Mecca today? Do you ever go to Mecca? No, or may take a ride out there?
Oh, I have been out there a number of times. I was there for their, and that was after Ed died. He died in 2011, but they celebrated their 100th anniversary of the school. And I presume that by now, Oasis has probably had their 100th anniversary. Mm-hmm. So I've been out there from time to time, and I actually spent the next 18 years at Mecca School until I took early retirement mm-hmm. in 1992.
Now,
I was 55.
When you were in the desert, did you think of teaching anywhere else, or you just wanted to stay at Mecca and that was good? That's what you liked?
Well, Ed and I talked about doing something someplace else. He loved the desert. Mm-hmm. I got to the point where I loved the desert. And we said, when we would talk about even selling this house or taking a place at the coast, why do we want to go through all this? We'd rather travel with the money that we have saved, not put it into another house. And I still had the house in Torrance that I was going to take over one day, which I decided, no, I'm not going to be a landlord. So when my mother died in 87, 88, I sold the house. And then we would laugh and we say, we live in a resort. Why are we going someplace else? In a couple or 3 hours, you can be at the coast. You can be in the mountains. You can be in San Diego. You can be in Mexico, for heaven's sakes.
But when you moved here, when you all moved in here, were you teaching in Mecca at the time? You were going back and forth?
No, I was teaching in Oasis.
Oh, I see.
Yes.
So
and then he taught and was at the Seaview School, but then he came back to Oasis in the afternoon. That was a 99-mile trip for him. Didn't bother him. He loved to drive anyway. So he would pick me up unless one of us had to go to a meeting or something, and then we would take 2 cars. When I went to Mecca, I picked up a friend who lived in Indio, and I either drove her car or drove my car, and for the next 18 years, we went back and forth together. She was Marilyn, she's still alive. She's 91 now and lives in Utah. She moved to Utah she married a rancher from here. Oh. She married one of the Sugimotos who had a ranch, and eventually
in La Quinta
turned it over. No, he was down at Oasis.
Oh, Oasis.
I met her at Oasis. She was probably the one person that I met that we just, again, she was like another Janet. We just fell into the same conversation from the day before, the month before, whatever it was. And she married Kot Sugimoto, who, again, nobody ever thought Kotz was going to get married, let alone married Marilyn, who was super Catholic. But in his older age, before he died, he was a Buddhist. And most of the Japanese families were at that time. But anyway, then they all started going to the Presbyterian or the Christian church. Kotz was doing the same thing, or sitting in the back pew of the Catholic church.
Which one? Over here?
Later.
Mm-hmm.
First it was in Indio.
Mm-hmm.
And then later, Marilyn and Kotz moved to Los Lagos over here,
mm-hmm.
off of Cook Street.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, he wanted to move to around Las Vegas.
Mm-hmm.
So they bought some property in Las Vegas, and they never lived in Las Vegas. They built a house then in St. George, Utah, which was even funnier because now we've got one person who's becoming a Catholic, Marilyn, who is Catholic. We just used to smile about this, and I'd say, Marilyn, what are you going to do next? Well, now she was giving tours of the Mormon temples that were in Utah, and it's like we all just wore different hats for wherever we were.
Different
and
cultures.
Joined in with all the communities.
Well, it sounds like you really had.
It was the same thing here.
The culture, the different cultures. Is
different, completely different. Yeah. Nobody worried about whether you called December Christmas or whether you called it a holiday, whether you called it a winter recess. I mean, we just all kind of fit in together.
You know, you were talking about when you were teaching. Describe some. You had a lunchroom, right? A hot lunch, right?
Yes.
The cafeteria. Well, like, what are some of the things they would have? Like, you put your tray down.
Compared to today, I think all the children, because I've been over to many of the schools since I've done the mini muster and the fire prevention business over the last 30 years, that I talked to some of the children, and about the only thing they want to eat is pizza.
I know. But what about you? I remember
when hot lunches came, the only time I ever took my lunch was on chili bean, spinach, and cornbread. I liked the beans, but I couldn't stand spinach, and I hated cornbread. So I would pack a lunch and take it that day. My husband ate every single luncheon that they served at any cafeteria. And I said, well, I can pack you a lunch because we always had the menu. No, he said, I'll eat in the cafeteria. They're grade A lunches.
Do you remember
when?
And
they had chicken
yes.
sometimes, and they would take the chicken. Some of the cafeteria workers would come over on a weekend and fix the chicken so that they could make different things all week out of these chickens. We had turkey for Thanksgiving. You know, it was ham and whatever it was. They tried to have some kind of meat for all the children.
Did they have, was it free lunches, or did they have to pay a quarter, or what? How did that work?
I paid a quarter when I went to school. And now we're back again, and now it's free. Now it's reduced price, and then it's probably 50 cents.
Yeah. Did they have homemaking at the school?
Yes. In fact, when I was teaching up north, Janet was a homemaking teacher. When I first came down here, Ed took it on himself to teach the shop class at Oasis School. And then he kind of backed away from that because the school nurse had to rush him to the doctor because he nearly cut off his thumb one day. But he went through it.
They had
We also had showers at the schools in the lower
after
valley.
gym? After the gym, or why did they?
Yeah. Well, and many of the children you see at that time, they were, and it was amazing. I mean, when I first went to some homes that were right across from the school, I didn't even realize that those homes were dirt floors.
Oh, is that right?
They were so clean and so swept. And they came over to Oasis School to get running water. And the school provided these big 5-gallon jugs for them to come over. And it wasn't until later that they had their own running water and so on and so forth. So because there was no way for the kids to take a shower, Bob Lumen and Ed Ruxton said, then we're going to provide showers for the children. And they did. I don't think they ever did at Mecca School, not that I was ever aware of, but they had a lot of special things. It was when I got to Mecca School that they started having somebody live on the campus. And so there was a caretaker there 24/7. At Oasis, it was sort of like everybody was on their own. We never had to worry about, you didn't lock your doors. I didn't lock the door here for years.
I know. I didn't when I first moved here. What was, do you have one student that you think about when you think, one student that stands out for you that was?
Oh, it's kind of funny, and I do have a couple of students that stand out. One was at Oasis School, and the other was at Mecca. And I actually, when I award, whichever you want to call it, for, I don't remember now whether it was, I have the plaques over here, for the Inspiration Award, which was a county award, or the and something else that I would, they would say, if you have an outstanding student, bring them with you. Well, I know I was at Oasis, and much later I called the principal at Jefferson School in Indio, and I asked her if she would come to this award event that was going on for me in Indian Wells. And she said, do you remember me? And I said, of course I remember you.
Really?
And she said, I didn't think you would. And at that point, she said, I'm 47 years old. And I said, well, now that makes me a lot older, doesn't it? Because when I started down there, I was 26 years old. 25, I guess, in fact. So I said, when I started school, I was at your school, I was 25. And I said, Esther, your name begins with E. And I won't even mention her last name. And I said, every single child in your family, I said, you had the nicest mother and father ever. And everybody's name started with E.
Oh.
And I said, you were all really good students. And I said, your mom would come in and help me. And I said, but I particularly remember you. And she said, why? And I said, not from the time I had you in kindergarten. I said, that was old hat. But I said, it was when your brother Ernesto came in and announced your birth.
Oh.
And she said, oh my gosh, my mother told me this story. And she said, I never thought it was true. And I said, yes. Ernie comes in, and they were all beautiful smiles, dimples. And he comes up for share and tell in the morning. And Ernie wants to tell about his new sister. Well, the kindergarten kids are sitting there, and they're going. They have all kinds of questions for Ernesto. But the main thing was, how big is she?
Right.
And poor Ernesto kept using his hands. Well, and then his hands would get smaller, and then they would get larger, and then they go up and down. And the children were just beside themselves. But Ernie, how big is she? And finally, Ernie just kind of shrugged his shoulders, and he says, they were pretty much bilingual by this time. It was like toward the end of the kindergarten year. And I taught mostly in English, and that's what I had a bilingual aide, but we tried to get everybody up to par. Well, anyway, so Ernie just put his shoulders down, and he shrugged them, and he said, well, if you want to know, she just fits in a drawer. And everybody knew. I said, Esther, I've known how big you were on the day after you were born and came home from probably,
so great.
it wasn't JFK, it was probably the Indio Memorial or whatever it was. It was La Casita before that even. And she laughed, and I said, I've always kept track of all of your family. Well, then when I got to Mecca, there was somebody that they said, bring somebody from a different school. So I thought, well, I could bring Esther again, but she said no, and I asked her. But anyway, so I brought a boy that I had in school. And it was like he was one of 5 boys in the family. And Mother, it was like, oh, Mother, are you going to have another one just because you want a girl? Well, this was probably the next to the youngest one. And he had done very well. The kids did pretty well in school. And he was very artistic, very creative. And by this time, when he's out of high school, and he's on television, and he's advertising the town of Indio. He was just one of those young men that just seemed like was a good person to do it. Well, anyway, he had his own graphics business, and he was working for Marriott and doing their logos and some of the hotels, the Hyatt, I remember, and a number of the Westin Hotel, and he was doing all that. And I thought, here's a good person. Nobody thinks that down on the east side of the lower valley are we going to have these, but there were some really excellent students that came out of there, so I chose that particular one. He was part of the Olivares family. And later, his big brother, one of his big brothers, he went actually, I didn't realize how creative he was. He went into the jewelry business, and he worked for somebody on El Paseo, and now he is in business for himself in Palm Springs. And then they had the one brother that was just a character. Mother says, Mrs. Ruxton, what'll I do with him? And I said, nothing, just love him like all the rest of them. I said, Gabriel is just gonna be Gabriel, no matter what he is. Talked all the time, lost things, never could concentrate on anything. Was always my, like, oh, okay. It was like, oh, Gabriel, not again. So when the boys talk about him, and I see some of them now and then, I say, and where is Gabriel? Well, he's married, he lives in Arizona, but Mrs. Ruxton, he hasn't changed. He just talks all the time. His wife puts up with him. His kids are wonderful. And the reason I remember Gabriel particularly is because he would tell you the darndest stories. And one day he comes in and he doesn't have his reading book. And he hadn't had his reading book. So I said, well, Gabriel, I'm just going to have to call your mom in and find out, because we need that book. Of course, I probably could have found another one, but Gabriel had to have some sense of responsibility. If I was going to die trying, I was going to be the one that was going to make him do it. So anyway, he comes in with the book, and his mother is with him, and she's always kind of looking like, oh, here we go again. And I say, Gabriel, why didn't you read those pages in your book? And he kept telling me he didn't have the pages in the book. That's why he didn't bring it, and he didn't know the words on the page. He's in first grade. And maybe, yeah, he was in first grade. So he actually had a book, a reader that he had. And I said, well, show me your book. So he kind of gingerly, I don't think Mother had looked at it, but he took it out, and it was like it had been buried someplace. And he took it out. And he wasn't lying to me. He didn't lie to his mother. He didn't have the pages in the book. He had cut them out of the book. And I said to his mother, kind of to the side, I said, and I had an aide because she didn't speak English. And I had an aide there, and I said, Sally, tell her we're going to have to do better on how to use a pair of scissors, because I said, that's awful. I said, I'm ashamed that I never taught him how to cut a page out of a book. So those are the kind of children that you remember, the top of the class, the bottom of the class. And he never was a bottom. He just didn't care about anything. Yeah. And you had to have somebody that could care. And it wasn't that he didn't care less. It was just that he was just kind of all over the place. A few years ago, Big Brother said, he hasn't changed, Mrs. Ruxton. If you met him today, you'd know Gabriel.
Is that what you think? Do you think that when people grow up, do you think that their personality pretty much stays the same, or have you seen people completely?
You know, since I have been around here for so long and started teaching and then taught for 35 years between my 4 years before I came to the Valley, 4.5 years before I came, that I can see the same children as grown-ups that I knew. Now, there are always those that do change, but generally speaking, I will know them. And I was over at the La Quinta Hotel some years ago, went into the restroom, and there was a girl that came in there, and she was fairly young. And I thought, geez, I'm married, I'm old by this time. And she looked in the mirror, and I looked at her. And she said, Mrs. Ruxton, do you know me? And I said, yes, you're Maria Carrillo. And she said, how would you still know me? I haven't seen you since I was in the second grade or the first grade. And I said, how many parent conferences between you and your two brothers and your cousins have I had with your parents? I said, somebody always looks like somebody else.
Oh, that's true.
And she just couldn't get over it. She says, I'll have to tell my mom and I'll tell Carlos. And I said, I've kept, if you can keep up. And then there's always the one that you meet at the mall and says, do you remember me? And you have no idea who you are talking to.
How do you handle that?
And I remember once my friend Marilyn and I were, before she left this valley and left Indian Wells, and we're at the mall, and these two girls come up, and the one of them says, Mrs. Sugimoto, do you remember me? Marilyn remembered everybody, more than I did. And I said, no. And then we both said together, I bet you didn't wear glasses when you were in first or second. She says, I did. Oh. Now, there weren't that many children who wore glasses. And to this day, I never could remember that child. And she said, and we couldn't tell her that. Right. We said, oh, well, and we tried to think, and then she gave us a couple of hints. So then we had to go along with what she said. But there'll be somebody, and maybe they were average, but no child that you ever had in school was average. If they came back and you saw their name in the paper, I saw in the Desert Sun a couple of weeks ago, 2 people that I had in school and had died.
Yeah. Oh.
Then I think, Adele, you're past 87 now. Maybe they're almost, 20 years behind you, but you didn't think about it at the time because you were an old person. And I was always known as the tall teacher with the short hair.
What do you think? How does the desert mean to you? I mean, it has a certain spirit, especially this mountain here in Indian Wells. Does the surroundings speak to you?
I think that the fact that I am surrounded by mountains in this valley and never had lived like that, and I was always a beach person. I always said I'll always go back to the beach. But because I don't have to go back to the beach, but I can go back to it, it's fine. And I've gotten so used to looking out the front and seeing the mountains. And before there was a hedge behind me, I could look at the mountains on the other side of, and I just love this being in a, and it's still a community.
I know.
Indian Wells, listen, you and I know that when summer comes, there's only about 2,500 people here who can get themselves into trouble. But on the other hand, during the regular year, we might be able to go to the store when there's 5,000 people here and not see anybody we know. But generally speaking, it's fun to go over to CVS or to go now into a grocery store and say, oh, hi, you know, really hot, isn't it? or this past winter, it was like, we know it's going to be hot, so enjoy the cold weather.
Yeah.
And I like the change of seasons.
I love it. If somebody was going to move here to the desert in general, what would you advise them? What do you think is good about the place?
Well, if you come in the spring,
okay,
beware that it's going to be hot by the time it gets to be the end of May. And also bring a coat with you, because by December and January, you're going to need it. And if you're going to go to Wild Lights, you will probably need your overcoat. And after all, when I look out here in January and February and see snow, not on Eisenhower Peak, which is what I kind of look out to the left, but when I see snow on the San Jacinto Mountains,
beautiful,
then I know that when I start out that day, if I'm going to probably turn the heat on in the car and not worry about the air conditioning. And the heat's going to be on. That goes on again, off again, and circulate all during the day. Or you can open up things and have the fresh air. But right now, we don't need fresh air. After all, and this is September. Talk about climate change.
Yeah.
This is crazy.
You've had a lot of experiences. What is the one piece of advice you would give that you learned that kept coming back to you as something special that you've discovered along the way? Mm-hmm.
Just keep going. Don't
really?
Give up. Even with my health issues now, I'm a very determined person, and I think, pretty orderly.
Mm-hmm.
My father used to say, as a child, he told that to Ed, be aware, she will always have neat piles of dirt. She always is neat. My sister was just the opposite. You knew when she came home. You knew when she was at this house. I mean, she cooked a dinner. She was an excellent cook. I don't know what she does now. I haven't seen her for a while. But I had to practically wash down the kitchen when she left. And Mother would say the same thing. When Kathy, it was her turn to clean the bathroom in the old house, she could spend the whole day. I want to get that over with. Change whatever needed to be changed, clean the drawers, do all this, and move on to something else. I like to stick with things. I find that I lose kind of focus and I don't feel like doing it. And I say to myself, you don't have to do that yesterday. You're retired. But I still want to do it, and I still want to get things finished. I never go to bed without every pillow on a chair or a sofa in its right place. I can't go to a meeting in the morning and not make my bed.
Yeah.
And when Ed got so sick and eventually died of the complications of dementia, I would go to those meetings. And a couple times I was late. And the woman who was directing them from EMC, she would say, and why are you late? She knew I was going to be late. And I'd say, I went back and I made the bed. And she would go, could you just please tell us when you come in that you did not go back because you suddenly had to make the bed? And I said, I can't do it. I said, that bed, even though I maybe just pull the covers over, but I said, it's going to be neat when I leave. And she says, I don't get you. I said, that's all right. Nobody else does either. Don't worry about it. And I don't worry about a lot of things. And sometimes I'm at fault when I don't worry about something. And then I think, well, if I'd worried about it, then maybe it would have gone a little bit better. Like, don't wait for 3 weeks to go see the doctor.